pandemic led to an increase in domestic violence and unemployment among women. Now, we know that is a pretty shocking and strong statement to make, but we will explore the implications throughout this episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first podcast episode. Here are Sofia and Paulina. I'm from Brazil. I'm double majoring in political science and international relations, and I'm interested in this topic because I wanted to investigate how women around the world were impacted by COVID.
Hi, guys. My name is Paulina, and I'm from Germany and also majoring in political science. And I was interested in this topic because we've seen so many research papers and articles cited on this topic, so many statistics, but we rarely see something that specifically addresses women as a subgroup. So we also don't know how it affects women.
So throughout this episode, we're going to be investigating the impact of COVID on gender inequality and whether high levels of female representation in positions of power led to better responses in terms of gender equality. A pretty interesting and important topic, so stay tuned. We're also going to be interviewing Dr. Haynes from Rollins College to bring some insights into our discussion. According to data provided by McKinsey & Company, a consulting company that gathers data for the government, women have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Women's jobs were almost 2 times more vulnerable to the crisis than men's jobs, and women account for 54% of all the job losses, even though they're underrepresented in the job market. Violence against women also increased dramatically during the pandemic, with the UN Secretary General even coining the term shadow pandemic to describe the increase in violence against women and girls that has been going largely unaddressed.
Our attention to this debate was brought by the remarkable book Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. Only through her research that we realized that most policies are created based on a male normative, which is also known as the default male. For example, dear listeners, have you ever thought about why women have to wait in such long lines for the bathroom while men do not? I bet a lot of you, and I did too, have simply assumed that this is normal and that maybe women just take longer in the bathroom. Well, as Perez explains it, this assumption is wrong. While it may appear that women and men's bathrooms have the same size, which would allude to a certain notion of equality, equality is not the component that we need in this situation. Especially in this situation, women and men have different biological needs, which means that equality will not in fact create the same outcome for them. If we can learn how to utilize equity instead of equality, we will realize that while the technical space of the bathrooms is the same, women have single stalls to account for their needs, while men have a higher number of urinals, which allows more men to use the bathroom, which creates the difference in capacity usage. So what we derive from this discussion is that in our daily lives, we're lacking equity by assuming equality, and we will continue this discussion throughout this podcast. More recently, the pandemic brought some of these concerns into discussion once again, with the rise in domestic violence and the increase in unemployment being particularly significant among women. In 2020, UN Women released its report on gender equality, warning that the impact of crises were never gender neutral and that COVID was no exception. Women and girls were being the most affected by economic and social drawbacks of the pandemic. Policies such as lockdowns and economic relief programs did not have a gender-neutral impact as they focused on equality versus equity. To bring some insights into today's discussion, we invited Dr. Pavielle Haynes to join us today. Dr. Haynes is a professor at Rollins College in the Department of Political Science, and her focus is on American politics. Thank you so much for joining us. We are very pleased to have you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Could you start by maybe telling us about your views on these findings and maybe why we should be concerned about them regarding how COVID disproportionately harmed women, especially in social and economic terms?
Yeah, it's not at all surprising. So very often we know that when a country faces a crisis, whether that's war or a recession or a pandemic, women are sort of used strategically in whatever way best benefits the country. And sometimes this can be mutually beneficial. So when we think about World War II, right, it helped the economy if women were working, and women benefited from that as well. But very often, what actually happens is that women don't benefit. They're harmed. They're sort of a casualty. And so when we think about the pandemic, right, the idea is women are this costless resource to exploit. They can do the unpaid labor, the elder care, the child care, all of the things that are shut down because of the pandemic in terms of schools, daycares, nursing homes. Rather than establishing policies to make those settings safer, the burden is just shifted to women.
Yeah, and so can you just tell us a little bit more about how during COVID women were specifically affected, just in terms of maybe access to healthcare, or even the increase in unemployment, or even how lockdown disproportionately affected women in terms of doing domestic chores and asymmetric obligations?
Yeah, so women were impacted in almost all areas of life, much more so than men. So first of all, when we think about unpaid labor, right, schools shut down, and that was the biggest piece of it, is that parents basically had nowhere to send their kids while they were working, and parenting became a 24/7 job. And what we know is that even though both men and women who were employed were working from home, disproportionately that burden fell on women. And so there's the mental impact of that, a mental health impact. Certainly we know that women expressed more anxiety and more depression than men throughout the pandemic, and I have a feeling that's going to continue in the aftermath. But also socioeconomically, what's happened is we've seen that because of this, women started leaving the workforce, right? There are only so many hours in the day, and if you're trying to balance unpaid labor versus paid labor, you have to choose. And also, we know that women tend to make less than men, and so in that situation, when you are a family thinking about, well, what do we do here? Very often the solution is, well, the female partner should leave her job. And so there's a socioeconomic loss there, and also in terms of healthcare and access to services, we know that women were harmed there as well.
We also saw a difference between European democracies and the US, even though women were still affected. In Europe, by COVID-19, the impact was smaller. For example, in Germany, it was found that unemployment had a relatively similar impact on men and women. And these countries were also concerned enough about gender dynamics to collect sex-segregated data, which can be critical in leading to policies that can better address the status of women. How did this scenario look like here in the U.S.? Was gender concern a national strategy?
Yeah, I heard very little discussion about the gendered impacts of COVID. I think there was some rumblings about, women leaving the workforce, but it didn't get a lot of attention, to be honest. And certainly there wasn't a lot of talk about how do we solve this or prevent it. And in a lot of European countries, they have two things going for them when it comes to gender equity. So one is, a lot of these countries actually have laws in place that say that whenever a policy is passed, it has to be examined through the lens of gender equity. And if there are disproportionate impacts on men and women, that has to be addressed. That cannot stand. We don't have anything like that in the U.S. Actually, men and women, there is nothing codified into law saying that they have to be equal under the law. And so in the U.S., very often, even outside of the pandemic, we pass policies that are not gender equitable, that disproportionately benefit men, or even that harm women. Now, most of the time, this isn't malicious. Some of the time, it can be, and it's intentional. But for the most part, it's more about the fact that most of our political representatives are men, and they're looking at the world through a male perspective, and they're not even thinking, oh, wait, this will have a negative impact on women. So that's part of the reason that I think we see that difference between the US and Europe. The other is that a lot of these European countries have really strong social infrastructure, by which I mean subsidized childcare, paid maternity leave, social welfare for low-income families, and all of these things helped to offset the impact of COVID on women, right? So if you know you have access to some sort of subsidization for childcare, maybe you can bring in a nanny if your daycare isn't open. Or, if daycare is subsidized and childcare workers are well paid, once things start to open again, they're going to come back. You're not going to have a shortage like we do in the U.S. So without that social safety net, right, the impact of COVID on women was much larger. So that's another reason we see that big difference between the two countries.
I think that the social net point is so interesting, and something that we also see a lot that happened during COVID is that intersectionality really matters. Single mothers from lower socioeconomic status, women of color, they were the ones that were even more negatively impacted by COVID. So we see that race, socioeconomic background, education, they all exercise an influence in how the pandemic will affect their reality. So could you just tell us a little bit more about this point of intersectionality?
Yeah, so women as a whole suffered more than men during the pandemic, but not every woman's experience was the same. So wealthier white women, for instance, perhaps they had more socioeconomic resources at their disposal, and so they could offset the lack of a social safety net, right? They could afford to personally hire a nanny or take unpaid time off from work because, certainly it's going to affect their family income, but maybe it means they don't get a vacation next year. Not that they're not going to be able to feed their children. Whereas when you look at women who are lower on the socioeconomic scale, they're kind of in a double bind because they can't afford to personally front money for childcare in lieu of school. But they also can't afford to take time off of work because, they're dependent on that income. And so they were hit much harder. The suffering there was much higher. And when we think of women of color, right, many of them are lower in income as well. And so they're suffering the same things. But then there's this added layer of medical inequity. And we know that women of color, right, people of color as a whole, were more likely to catch COVID and develop serious illness. This is in part because of the types of jobs that they're in. They're more likely to be exposed, and then lack of adequate medical care made them more vulnerable to serious illness and death. And so women of color there were hit absolutely the hardest. And so we really saw the lack of gender equity, the lack of social infrastructure impacting them the most.
So based on that, do you think the U.S. channeled sufficient efforts to prevent the pandemic from exacerbating, impacting pre-existing inequalities, or did they not?
Absolutely not. So when you think about the relief packages, for instance, the vast majority of that money went to business owners. And sometimes large business owners, mostly small business owners. But when you think about, who owns businesses, disproportionately, it's men, not women. And I don't think that was taken into account at all when we're thinking about how do we blunt the impact of the pandemic, socioeconomically at least, for women. That was not a helpful solution. That really did mostly help men. So I don't think enough attention was given to issues of gender equity there.
So this was Dr. Haynes sharing with us her thoughts on how COVID disproportionately impacted women and girls. Thank you so much, Dr. Haynes, for joining us today. You have brought some really insightful considerations to our discussion. So throughout the creation of this podcast, we have uncovered how the underrepresentation of women in the design of public policies can lead to unequal impact across gender. In the case of COVID, the pandemic had unique impacts on women, largely due to underlying inequalities. But these considerations were not accounted for in most public health strategies and economic relief programs. One of the main reasons is because women are not equally integrated in the design of public policies and lack access to resources. We have established that we need more public policies and sex-segregated data in order to really include women in the political process.
Yes, guys, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you really enjoyed this whole interview and the discussion. If you want to write us your own thoughts or a letter on this topic, feel free to do so. And see you in the next podcast episode.